It's a great pleasure and privilege to be back here again. I had the pleasure of being here last year, and it's very nice to be back. And I'm very grateful to Ian and his colleagues who organised this. This is the second year. Somebody said to me earlier on, this is make or break year. And I think your presence tonight on such a horrible night is an indication of the support that exists for this festival of ideas and the kind of debates that it seeks to promote. So thank you all for being here on a Friday night. I really appreciate it. And I do want to involve you all tonight in the debate that we're going to have. Last year we talked about a republic, what a republic meant and what our republic was and is. And I mentioned that there's a certain danger perhaps when we're talking about the 19th century and parallels with the 21st century. There's perhaps a danger of contrivance when seeking to make parallels between the 1840s and the early 21st century. And I suppose it's necessary for me as a historian to repeat that caution tonight. Context, of course, is everything. And I would qualify everything I say by emphasising that very strongly. Notwithstanding, of course, there are certain words, certain phrases, certain descriptions that are associated with 19th century nationalists that do resonate down through the decades, that we do recognise today. Perhaps we don't think about them as much as we should, but we're certainly familiar with them. The words of those who you could say were deep thinkers, people who cared about ideas, people who wrote about ideas and articulated their case with considerable passion at a time when there was a premium being placed on the printed word, and the printed word was becoming much more accessible. And those individuals were very much products of that 19th century period, the early 19th century into the mid-19th century, with all the attendant difficulties, opportunities and traumas. And there's no need for us to romanticise them in any way. We would be doing them a great disservice if we were to romanticise the 19th century nationalists. We do need, as I mentioned, to contextualise them. And when we mentioned the Republic last year, one of the reasons we focused on it was because formally this state became a republic in 1949, which was exactly 100 years after the death of James Fintan Lalor. And in looking at how that republic evolved and ideas around Irish republicanism evolved, some of the issues that came up last year included what it meant in practice. What did a republic mean in practice? How might it be defined? Where lay civic engagement, social solidarity, citizenship, the embracing of ideas after the establishment of that republic, and indeed amongst the generation who fought for that republic and aspired towards it? How debased had the Irish Republic become was another issue that came up last year, largely because of the very strong contributions, not just from the panel, but also from the floor. But also that basic question, what is a republic? What does it mean to us now? What does it mean to different generations? And I would suggest that tonight we are facing another fundamental question, another basic question, but an equally complex question. What the hell is a nation? And if you think of that phrase that we are all familiar with, a nation once again, that is a phrase that we associate with Thomas Davis. And it's fitting, I suppose, that we remember Thomas Davis this particular month, which is the bicentenary of his birth in 1814. And he was, of course, of the era of James Fintan Lalor. And neither of those men, Thomas Davis or James Fintan Lalor, were one-dimensional. Let's not forget that. But they did, I would suggest, share certain dilemmas of that period in the 19th century. They both struggled in particular with the dominance of Daniel O'Connell, an extraordinary individual, not just in a national sense, but in an international sense. They struggled with the dominance of Daniel O'Connell, and they struggled with framing an alternative to the politics of Daniel O'Connell, to O'Connellism as it became known. And a lot of the related questions of the era are relevant to our debate tonight. How do you constitute freedom, or how do you define freedom? If you look at Daniel O'Connell's insistence through the repeal movement, for example, the attempt to repeal the union between Britain and Ireland, he insisted that it had to be achieved, this repeal of the union, by moral combination alone. That was a description that was used by Daniel O'Connell in the context of the repeal movement. Daniel O'Connell also insisted in 1841 that Ireland was a nation before I was born. And Daniel O'Connell was born in 1775. That was a very interesting assertion, and it was also arguably a very controversial assertion, particularly when you look at the response of Thomas Davis. He responded by suggesting that his primary duty was to make Ireland a nation yet. A very important qualification and a very important articulation of the difference between his thinking and that of Daniel O'Connell. And yet, at the same time, he was very loyal to Daniel O'Connell in many respects. Thomas Davis's famous ballad, A Nation Once Again, followed in July 1844 in The Nation, in that newspaper, a very important newspaper. Davis, unfortunately, died at a very young age the following year in 1845, and he was a noble character in many respects. He studied and reflected very deeply on an awful lot of subjects: music, education, archaeology, temperance, rural life, and crucially Europe. He was very interested in looking outside of Ireland. He wasn't a shallow populist. If you look, for example, at his views on education, which brought him again into conflict with Daniel O'Connell and Daniel O'Connell's followers, he was insistent that you couldn't have an inclusive nationalism unless you had mixed education. And that was something that was causing difficulties during that period. He was also somebody who could not be labelled a pacifist. He believed that there were certain circumstances in which force was justified, but he was by no means a warmonger. And in a way, I think Thomas Davis provided a break of sorts on some of his colleagues when you consider that generation of young Irelanders, as they became known. After the death of Thomas Davis, they do become more militant. They do perhaps become a bit more crude in how they express their views and in how they justify their particular approach to what is then, as they see it, the national question. You could say that Thomas Davis and others of that era, including James Fintan Lalor, were also contradictory and full of naivety. And why wouldn't they have been, given what they were trying to do as pioneers? He insisted, Thomas Davis, for example, in relation to his fellow Irish men, Protestant Irish men, gentlemen, you have a country. Thomas Davis talking about those who were of the same religious background as himself. Gentlemen, you have a country. This idea that they had to accept this definition he was proffering of nationalism and of a nation, that it was about uniting all of these people, that it was about bringing together orange and green. Did that completely underestimate or downplay the depth of the sectarian passions that were evident during that period? Was he somebody who was conveniently sidestepping some of those difficulties? Arguably, he was. Perhaps that was a feature not just of that era, but of other eras. He also insisted that a people without a language was only half a nation. And therein lay a considerable irony. Thomas Davis made many passionate arguments about the importance of the Irish language, but he made them by writing in the English language. He didn't master the language himself. He was not proficient in it in any way. And again, he wasn't particularly unusual in that regard. Now, a few years after his premature death, James Fintan Lalor approached Charles Gavin Duffy, who was the editor of the Nation newspaper and who had worked closely with Thomas Davis during his life. And he suggested that there was a need at this stage, because of the break with Daniel O'Connell after 1846, there was a need for a much broader and more radical, as he saw it, definition of nationalism, that in particular would include land as one of its aims. He also insisted, and this is important, that this kind of nationalism that he was propounding, a new nationalism, could not confine itself to what he called moral force. And that phrase, moral force, has always intrigued me. It's deeply fascinating, but also problematic. But that was what James Fintan Lalor suggested at that stage was needed. And let us not forget the trauma of that period, in particular the Great Irish Famine, in particular the European upheavals that we associate with the 1848 revolutions. Those thoughts were thoughts of that era, and they were a product of that era. There were ideas, there were disputes, there were disagreements, there was, crucially, a lack of popular support for many of these notions that were being articulated. And there was no shortage of snobbery either, if you consider those who were putting forward ideas on behalf of those that they hadn't necessarily consulted or didn't necessarily understand or even perhaps wish to understand. And again, this is part of the complexity of that period of 19th century Irish and indeed European history. So when we consider all of these, when we consider the Irish turmoil, the European turmoil, when we consider the contested definitions of Irish nationalism, of what a nation was, we can see the extent of the confusion. We can see the extent of the searching. We can see the extent, perhaps, of the intellectual engagement, but also the shortcomings in that intellectual and indeed political engagement. I have no idea what a nation is, and I wouldn't pretend to know what a nation is. But I do often consult widely to enlighten myself in relation to how nationalism, or the answer to that question, what is a nation, has been tackled at various stages by various people. And to finish, I'm going to give you three very brief definitions of what is a nation from different eras. The first is from Ernest Renan, who was a 19th century French philosopher who wrote in 1882 what's now a very well-known paper about what a nation is. And he suggested that a nation is a great solidarity created by the sentiment of the sacrifices which have been made and those which one is disposed to make in the future. Another definition of nationalism comes from James Joyce through a fictional character, Leopold Bloom, in 1904. A nation is, according to Leopold Bloom, the same people living in the same place. And then another one, Karl Deutsche, a great political scientist, Czechoslovakian, 1969. A nation is, according to him, a group of people who are united by a mistaken view about the past and a hatred of their neighbours. That'll give you some idea of the range of definitions of nationalism that we've had from the 19th century up to the late 20th century. So where are we now in relation to defining a nation? Where are we in the early 21st century regarding our thinking about nationalism and what a nation might be? Are we a nation at all? Were we ever a nation? What is involved in becoming a nation? And if we are tonight to draw parallels between the 1840s and where we are now, how exactly do we go about that? And how exactly do we tackle that particular challenge? This is the challenge, of course, from my esteemed panel here. I'm delighted, and I'm sure you are, that we are being joined by people who are going to address this particular question, and they're all distinguished in many different ways. Micheál Martin is the leader of the Fianna Fáil party. We also have Jack O'Connor, who's president of SIPTU. We have Michael Starrett, who's chief executive officer of the Heritage Council. We have Regina E. Chulatoin, who is a lecturer in UCD and an esteemed colleague, and of course also a local girl, as they would describe you down here. And we have Owen Harris, journalist, writer, and political philosopher. So they are our guests tonight, and I'd ask you to welcome them, please.